Hello everybody, it's Peter Goring, and in this video, we're going to be going over liberalism caused imperialism. Obviously, there were liberal imperialists, and I don't think imperialism is an inherently bad thing. I'll go into that later in the video. But he makes a lot of false claims about liberalism, and he tries to demonize liberalism. So let's go into it.
Hello and welcome to Historia Ecclesiastica. In this Enlightenment and the World Wars video, we're going to continue discussing how the Enlightenment caused World War I. And here to begin this video, we'll especially be talking about how liberalism caused imperialism, which will come as a shock to anyone that's taken a history course in a university where you've learned that big, bad, conservative Catholicism is the cause of all evil and the cause of the imperialist conquests of the world. But we're going to learn here that there is a distinction between the first...
Okay, he's not going to go into it. Okay. He basically goes into like a prayer and stuff. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, he does. So let's get past that.
Causes imperialism. Please like and share and subscribe, and don't forget to leave a comment as you watch on your disagreements, additional information, or a prayer for the United States of America. Let's review what liberalism is in general, since I'm accusing it of causing imperialism. Liberalism could be understood in a narrow sense as belief in liberal government, such as a democracy that respects human rights, therefore giving people freedoms. But in general, liberalism could be understood as the desire to be liberal or free in respect to traditional theology, philosophy, and beliefs, especially...
It depends what you mean by traditional. You could have a liberal society that's built off of Christian principles and have some inherently Christian laws. You can have a liberal society that even is under a monarchy. The Enlightenment philosophers had their own idea of a great monarch, and many believed Frederick the Great to embody this principle, as Voltaire even did, the guy you have in this photo. So, Rousseau even believed in a kind of state religion, but I guess the state religion wasn't that traditional.
Liberal thought wants to be free or liberated from the restrictions of divine revelation and Catholic tradition. In practice, liberal thought is pragmatically atheist. By definition, liberal thought wants to ignore divine revelation, to be free from divine revelation, or in order to pursue truth.
Not entirely. So, for example, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I'm sure you're familiar with him, he advocated for a civil religion to foster social cohesion, patriotism, and obedience to the law. So, for example, he believed religion was kind of needed for civil unity. And he also believed that the people of a nation should hold to particular dogmas, such as the existence of a powerful, wise, and benevolent deity. So it's not atheistic, that's affirming God's existence. The afterlife, so it's not even deistic, because it's affirming God interacting with mankind, giving them an afterlife. The happiness of the just, the punishment of the wicked. So God's interacting, he's punishing the bad and glorifying the good, and the sanctity of social contract and laws. So God's directly interacting with the state. So the state is in obedience to God. And Rousseau also argued that atheists could not be trusted to obey the law, and along with those who do not follow the civil dogmas, could be banished or face a death penalty. In particular, people like Voltaire would also say religious liberty is not granted to atheists. So it's not atheistic. Liberalism historically persecuted atheists to a certain extent.
According to however you in your own subjective mind wants to pursue and divine truth, and generally liberalism depends on...
It's not true when Rousseau, according to some interpretations, is giving the death penalty to those who don't even affirm an afterlife or a last judgment and damnation of the wicked. Some radical universalist Christian himself wouldn't even fit for some of Rousseau's dogmas, let alone an atheist or a deist, because a deist would say that God does not punish or glorify the wicked or the just because God does not interact with the world or the creation, right?
Naturalistic rationalism, which only wants to use reason, which is deducted from things we see in nature, and wants to ignore anything that the church says is true above nature, any supernatural.
There's liberal philosophy, like Rousseau himself was critical of a lot of the Enlightenment's reliance on reason, and there's also liberal, I don't know, would you say Kant is liberal? I don't know. Somewhat liberal figures like Kant, especially in philosophy, I guess, who do more liberal, deviating from the schoolmen, i.e. the scholastics, who also wrote books against kind of this radical form of rationalism. It's called Critique of Pure Reason, and yeah, he was liberal. He said that Hume awoke him from the slumber of dogmatism. So you can read like Kant, Critique of Pure Reason. It utterly demonstrates that this guy's generalization is false.
truths the church teaches us about. So liberal thought is pragmatically atheistic, even if particular liberals may claim to be Christian.
Legally speaking, it's not. For an example, there's a liberal country, such as the U.S. I think we'd all agree that it's liberal. The U.S. has declared itself a Christian nation. For an example, the Church of the Holy Trinity of the United States, 1892. Justice. This is, by the way, after they were done doing state religious tests. They banned that because the 14th Amendment in the 1860s. This is 30 years after that. Justice David J. Brewer wrote that this is a Christian nation. So, and he referenced the American life, laws, and customs to support his conclusion. So the American laws, so that's the pragmatic basis of America, is Christian according to the Supreme Court, even after they banned state religious tests.
Or believe in God, their system of liberal thought is pragmatically atheistic. It was the Enlightenment which gave the world liberalism. And as we talked about in part 1 here, it was called How the Enlightenment Caused World War I. We talked about how there's a direct train of succession of cause and effect from the Enlightenment, okay, to, well, let's just go through it here. Let's talk about that same train of effect here. So the Enlightenment is the school of thought.
Some liberals were actually counter Enlightenment. That's not entirely true. For an example, you couldn't say that's like someone like Rousseau, for an example, was harshly criticized by more Enlightenment figures. And there's people like Isaiah Berlin, who is a liberal. He's a very modern liberal. And even he's critical of a lot of the Enlightenment views, such as their tendency towards monism and so forth. So I wouldn't say that the Enlightenment caused liberalism.
Which goes hand in hand with the scientific and technological revolutions. In the end of the
which were both good things.
16th century and the early 17th century, Francis Bacon develops the modern scientific method. And from his work, we have an explosion of scientific thought, which is intrinsically good. Being able to understand the natural world for what it is more clearly helps us to appreciate God's creation. So the natural sciences are good. And it is the natural sciences, the principles that were developed in the scientific revolution, which led to the technological revolutions, the invention of technologies which had greater and greater abilities. Now, the Enlightenment goes hand in hand with the scientific revolution, and
the scientific revolution was obviously opposed by the Catholic Church. For an example, Galileo being tried because his scientific findings contradicted the unanimous consent of the Church Fathers. So figures like St. Robert Bellarmine said, well, it goes against all the Church Fathers. Trent is true, which says all the consent of the Church Fathers ought to be accepted. Thus, we're going to suppress particular scientific findings that go against the consensus of the Church Fathers. And then Galileo didn't really know how to respond because he was not a theologian. He was a scientist. And there's other things, I guess you could argue, like, for an example, with the Industrial Revolution, Pope Gregory XVI, he banned trains from being entered into the Vatican. So the popes have also criticized not just scientific findings, but also more advanced technological findings.
Tries to say, look at what great things are being done in the natural sciences. Let's apply that same sort of razor-sharp rationalism, and let's shed off all of the preconceived notions that we've ever had about philosophy in general.
Gregory XVI, by the way, the Pope, declared the railroad system, which was a heavy part of the Industrial Revolution, quote, the roads of hell. So, yeah, the church opposed both technological advancement and scientific advancement in a certain respect. Although you could grant, like, there was a specific, I guess, Catholic theologian who was the father of the Big Bang. But yeah, you could argue him, I guess. But I mean, to be fair, the popes historically before that were young Earth creationists. I can get quotes on that. When he's done over this, I'll go into that.
Or theology in general, metaphysics in general. And let's come up with a fresh, new, empirically verified sense of reality, which is devoid of the supposedly childish fantasies of faith. So the scientific revolution kind of has the Enlightenment taking the principles of the scientific revolution and applying some of those principles to philosophy and theology where empiricism really doesn't help. Okay. And it's the Enlightenment.
Here, I'll get the list of quotes. Here, I got it. So here's against heliocentrism. I'll get that one too. Bellarmine, he says that It contradicts the scriptures, and he refers to various passages of the scriptures, which are difficult to reconcile with heliocentrism. This is from Theological Status of Heliocentrism, page 3. Page 4, it also goes into that the Holy Office, which was the theologians of the Pope, abandoned the position in question and no more to hold, teach, or defend it. On pain of being proceeded against by the Holy Office, Galileo promises to obey. So that's like one we have, I guess. There's other ones but we profess obedience to the decrees made by the Supreme Pontiff against the movement of the earth. Theological Status of the Heliocentrism, page 7. So very basic scientific findings found within the scientific, development process was being imposed to by not even just like theologians, but by the Pope himself.
Which is kind of a child of the scientific revolution, which is going to end up affecting Western thought in general. And it's going to start moving a wide variety of social institutions of Western society away from faith and away from a connection with Christianity in general. And it's going to start to separate the many different elements of Western society from the church.
Well, it depends what type of Christianity. More decentralized Christian groups like the Quakers, like the Congregationalists, or the Puritans, and so forth, they were actually given a lot of political power due to liberalism. And America kind of is developed in the kind of, I guess you could say, Quaker fashion. By this more decentralized Protestant understanding, I would say that's what America is representing. So I would say decentralized Christian groups gained a lot of political authority and prominence under liberalism. But of course, the more centralized religious groups that require some type of obedience, of course, did not.
And make them pragmatic.
Well, they could have under a liberal state, because someone like Rousseau, for an example, was fine with there being a religious state that requires belief in an afterlife and judgment and so forth.
Pragmatically atheistic or liberal. The technological revolution, the invention of important machines, especially combustion, and coal-powered engines or steam-powered boats, is going to end up giving us the Industrial Revolution, as well as the Enlightenment thought of Adam Smith articulated in The Wealth of Nations. Smith is going to move Western society away from a mercantilist sense of the economy,
away from feudalism, which heavily exploited peasants.
That there's a set number of resources which need to be shared amongst all people of the world. There's a set amount of wealth, a static amount of wealth, and Adam Smith is going to give the world what forms into capitalism. The idea that one can generate new wealth by creating new products which people want to purchase. In Adam Smith's system, greed is seen as a virtue because...
No, it's not. If you read Wealth of Nations, or really any basic thing, you could find out that this is not the case. I could pull up the quote here. This is from Wealth of Nations, Book 5, Chapter 2, Part 2, Article 1, page 911, page 911. A tax upon house rents, therefore, would in general fall heaviest upon rich, and in this sort of inequality there would not perhaps be anything very unreasonable. It is not very unreasonable that the rich should contribute to the public expenses, not only in proportion to the revenue, but something more than in that proportion. So essentially, he believes the rich are obligated to help the common good, i.e. the public systems, and they should be obligated to pay for it. Someone like Andrew Carnegie, he wrote a book actually saying that rich people are, he's also an industrial figure. He wrote The Gospel of Wealth, which basically argues that rich people ought to be obligated to be the trustees for poor people. So he didn't believe greed was a virtue. That's completely false.
It is greed which motivates people to start factories, which is a great personal expense, and there's a lot of labor involved in order to generate more wealth, in order for themselves to be wealthy. But in the process, as a factory owner becomes wealthy, more wealth is generated for society in general and the entire society.
Yeah, because he's paying for the public expenses, which then help the middle and lower class citizens of that nation.
Becomes more wealthy. Adam Smith is very intelligent, but the idea that greed itself is a virtue is going...
which he did not hold.
...to cause the Industrial Revolution to be intrinsically flawed at its heart.
Which it was not, because again, popular industrialists like Carnegie wrote books advocating for rich people, industrialists, which he was an industrial himself. He was one of the most famous industrialists in history. He himself advocated for this idea of rich people being the trustees for poor people instead of the government being it. And then you get into a post-Enlightenment situation, which is after World War II, you get Keynesian economics, which promotes a welfare state, which is obviously not holding great to be a virtue because you're then providing welfare for middle and lower class people.
Because this is going to lead factory owners to celebrate their unchecked greed and have no reservation.
Which they did not celebrate, by the way, just to be clear, because again, the gospel of wealth is a good example that they did not celebrate that.
About frankly abusing their factory workers. This could have been avoided if Adam Smith was more informed by and more faithful to traditional Christian.
Yeah, traditional Christian. Let's see what it was like under feudalism, your economic system before the Enlightenment or before the spread of liberalism. Peasants were legally tied to the land and could not leave or marry without the Lord's permission. That's pretty insane. You can marry and live your life without your factory owner's permission. Peasants were forced to work the Lord's private land without pay while having limited time to farm their own, often small plots. They had to pay fees, taxes, and tributes to both the Lord and the church, leaving them with little to no surplus food. Oh, well, that's good, right? Due to high taxation and labor duties, peasants lived at the edge of survival, where a single bad harvest could result in mass starvation. Lords possessed judicial authority, acting as both judge and creditor in their own manorial courts, which they used to enforce labor obligation and collect fines. Life was characterized by rampant disease, lack of sanitation, and high infant mortality. They were also vulnerable to violence from soldiers, brigands, or during interlord wars. That is not a good life to live. I think we, in a liberal society, live a lot better than they did under a traditional Catholic society.
The Industrial Revolution is going to allow the various nations of the Western world to develop far greater wealth. Now, at the same time, and independent of the Industrial Revolution, Western nations are losing their sense of what the overall purpose of their society is. During the period of Christendom, in which all Western societies, all Western nations recognized that their nation had a purpose of serving God, that God was the ultimate end of every element of society, and that all elements of society should be ordered towards God glory, should not promote sin, should try to help people to live a holy life. That sense is gone now because of Enlightenment thought, which...
That's completely false. When you go to the United States, for an example, and you cite the Pledge of Allegiance, which all people generally cite, you say we're one nation under God, and I can actually get this. One Supreme Court case actually declared that all of our institutions presuppose a supreme being. Let me find that actually. All right, it was Zorach v. Clausen. For 30 U.S. 306, 1952. The court held that accommodating religious needs, or that's not the one. Yeah, it was the one. Justice William O. Douglas, so Supreme Court Justice in this case, and it was passed, said, quote, and by the way, this is about the liberal state of the U.S. in 1952. We are a religious people whose institutions presuppose a supreme being. So the institutions of a liberal country are guided or directed to a supreme being according to the Supreme Court.
Got Westerners to begin to perceive theology as childish faith. And
that's completely false.
And rationalism began to be perceived as more of a mature...
No, it was not. I mean, you have, again, liberal philosophers all the way back in the 1700s, like Kant, writing books against rationalism with the critique of pure reason. You have early liberal philosophers, or even Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire, arguing that if there was not a God, we would need to create him for society.
Sort of intellectual system. So, when Western nations lose the sense that the purpose of their nation is to serve God, the question remains, well...
Which they did not lose the sense of, as we even demonstrated in the 1950s, America was declaring that our institutions presuppose a supreme being. And by the way, in early liberal countries, you even had religious tests for a state.
What is the ultimate purpose of the nation? What's the ultimate purpose of the state?
It's to serve the... It depends. The liberals say it, actually. Some would say to serve the common good. Some would say to serve the people. Some would say to serve God.
To serve itself.
Depends what itself is. For example, a Volkist would say to serve the people, and itself is the people as the corporation of a body. But a liberal would generally say a nation is propositional, like the U.S., for an example, and you serve the proposition of that nation. No, you generally serve the people that are under this propositional land, as the people are not the nation itself. The nation itself is the proposition. The people are those who reside in or inhabit that particular land.
Eventually, the nation itself becomes the end for
This is just Volkism. This isn't even liberalism.
which the state exists, and all the institutions of the state exist to serve the nationality. The nationality takes on a sort of spiritual persona. It starts to become sort of like a mystical reality, the British nation, the German Volk. And so the nation itself becomes sort of like a deity that everything in this.
I mean, if you're talking about liberal nationalism would just argue that a stable state requires a shared inclusive national identity that is committed to democracy, rights, and culture. So if what you're just trying to say is you serve democracy, rights, and culture, then okay. I don't see how that would provoke any war, per se.
State is oriented towards serving. Because of nationalism, people begin to celebrate the glory of the nation even more so than they celebrate the glory of God.
Well, what if they just say God wants them to celebrate the glory of the nation, thus they're glorifying God by that?
And the state seeks to promote and defend the glory of the nation above even the glory and the service of God.
That's not true at all. I mean, just look at any basic Supreme Court case where they affirm that our institutions, again, presuppose God. So you're glorifying God by glorifying the institution. I mean, you have one nation under God. I mean, come on, this is a basic line.
Leads Western nations to want to quickly plunge into war because war is perceived as the ultimate expression of one's loyalty for the nation. Warfare itself is sort of like the altar to the idolatrous cult of hyper-nationalism. And in the video...
I mean, that's not true at all. Immanuel Kant, for an example, argued in Perpetual Peace that a republican constitution where citizens who bear the cost of war decide on it. And usually citizens don't want to go get slaughtered. Erasmus, who you could argue was sort of a proto-liberal philosopher, he regarded war as a product of stupidity and a cause of immense waste. Joseph Schumpeter argued that democratic market societies are inherently peaceful because war is inefficient. So I think that, yeah, I mean, that in and of itself just shows, I mean, it's not a universal principle of liberalism. And a lot of the countries starting war, like Germany, hated liberalism. Like, for an example, Wolfgang J. Mommsen, a historian, identified Wilhelm II as an autocratic leader whose popularity rested on his image as a strong militaristic leader, contradicting any notion of him being a liberal monarch. John C.G. Rohl, perhaps the most authoritative biographer of Wilhelm II, he demonstrates that the Kaiser was deeply anti-Semitic and was a staunch supporter of the monarchical principle and exercised negative personal rule that undermined democratic development. And even you yourself said liberalism would generally hold this kind of democratic understanding. It was mainly autocrats, i.e. the declining aristocracy of old Europe, which he'll go into, which I like to call aristocratic Europe, that was starting these wars.
Before I did, definitely clarify that nationalism, pride, and, loving one's nationality, whether, you are German or you are Irish or whatever you are, taking pride in loving your nation or taking pride in loving your particular country you live in, patriotism, both of these things are very good. We should love our communities, beginning with our family, our villages, and then our nations. But we should overall recognize that all humanity was created one family by God, descended from.
Yeah, I mean, this is held by liberals. You have the universal understanding of natural rights. Unfortunately, you would actually not hold this because you would say that someone who happens to not be of your faith is not equal deserving of the same rights that you are deserving of. For example, you see Exsurge Domine, which basically holds that it's the will of the Holy Spirit to basically kill people who don't hold your faith. This is a condemning certain propositions held by Luther. The 33rd condemned proposition is that heretics be burned is against the will of the Holy Spirit. So you would say that not everyone deserves rights, only people of your faith. Heretics don't deserve rights. A liberal would say everyone deserves rights, no matter where they come from, no matter their faith and so forth. Except maybe some liberals like John Locke who might restrict religious liberty for atheists, which obviously is not held by the United States or more modern liberal states.
Adam and Eve. And also, all of humanity is called to become even more so one family in Jesus Christ in the church. So if we recognize our true citizenship is in heaven.
In the church, notice that. So if someone decides to deviate from your faith, you believe they thus lose their rights, as Exsurge Domine kind of demonstrates.
and not on this earth. We can both be patriotic, we can be, in a sense, nationalists, loving our nations, but at the same time, this isn't our highest goal. We recognize that our membership in heaven is far more important to who we are than our nationality. So,
and a liberal state could be completely reconcilable with this. Someone like Rousseau, who would say that you ought to believe in an afterlife, or you can face banishment or the death penalty. I mean, the same thing would be applied, even according to some liberal philosophers like Rousseau.
all these factors we've just talked about are going to end up leading to the new
But someone like Rousseau would say if you don't affirm the filioque way, some really minuscule thing, you're not going to be killed for it, right? Well, you would say if you don't affirm these little minuscule things, and you ought to be, it would be, well, you don't ought to be, but it would be fine if you were killed by virtue of exerge domine.
Imperialism. So historians separate the old imperialism, which took place after Christopher Columbus's discovery of the Western Hemisphere in the
old imperialism, which is dominated mainly by anti and non-liberals. Yes, I call old I distinguish this a little bit more in an equivocal sense. I would say old imperialism was heavily influenced by aristocratic Europe, so I'm going to give them that title. And new imperialism, I think, is a lot more equivocal than old imperialism. I'll go into that.
Late 15th and then the 16th centuries, and we can separate that period of imperialism from the new imperialism, which takes place in the second half of the 19th century. So we are going to talk about here how the fruits of the Enlightenment that we just summarized so far in this video are going to lead the European nations to colonize the entire world with far more vigor than they ever had in the old imperialism. The late 19th century period of imperialism was far more expansive, and it had more lasting and negative effects on global politics and global economics than the old imperialism had. Okay, we're going to talk about how the new imperialism was caused by the institutions which the Enlightenment got moving in the 18th century. So if you're in college and you're learning about how big bad Catholics caused imperialism, and that's really bad, just remember, most of the damage that people think of when they think of the damage caused by imperialism is late 19th imperialism, and that was caused by the ruling ideology of that period, the Enlightenment, not by Catholicism. So let's talk about the whole geopolitical situation of the 19th century, so we can better understand all the conditions that led to imperialism, but also World War I, which we're going to finish this video with. So the long 19th century is usually referred to as the historical period between 1750 and 1913. Here we're going to talk about the historical period between 1789, the French Revolution, and 1913, the outbreak of World War I. So we begin with talking about how Enlightenment thought and Freemasonry, the agents of the Enlightenment, fomented throughout all the institutions of the West.
Freemasons are not correctly called the agents of the Enlightenment. I mean, you had Freemasons that hated the Enlightenment and were Catholic traditionalists, like Joseph de Maistre, who figures like Julius Evola, a big critic of the Enlightenment. I don't think you would say Evola is consistent with the Enlightenment at all. Call the forefather of their kind of critiques of the Enlightenment. I mean, you're basically spouting similar rhetoric to someone like Joseph de Maistre would. I mean, he's the most anti-Enlightenment figure you could think of, and he himself was an ultramontanist also, which was far less liberal than even pre-Enlightenment France, because the pre-Enlightenment French were at least Gallicans, which you would say is a very problematic and not a traditional Catholic. De Maistre is the embodiment of traditional Catholicism within politics, yet he himself was a Freemason. So calling them the agents of the Freemasonry just shows your lack of education in this regard.
And pragmatically atheistic thought and secular rationalism throughout Western society. The Enlightenment movement, Freemasonry in general, led to the birth of the first secular state in France, which radically revolted against the church, executing hundreds of priests and sending tens of thousands into exile, even executing a convent of nuns, Carmelite sisters.
Yeah, and this was condemned by like mainstream liberals, like, I don't know, Alexander Hamilton, for an example, and more moderate Enlightenment thinkers like De Lafayette didn't partake in this. And there were extreme radicals, and they killed each other, like the cult of reason, the cult of supreme being. Nobody's supporting, like Robespierre, for an example, unless you're maybe like a dialectical materialist who would say that this is a necessary set of events for there to be the final revolution of, I don't know, Marxism. I mean, you would say this was the bourgeoisie revolution, which led to the Marxian, which is going to lead to the Marxian revolution. But I'm not a Marxist, so I wouldn't say that. From like a liberal perspective, what he did was obviously wrong. He's violating the natural rights of Catholics to be able to partake in their religion, and they should not have been killed.
Now,
and Napoleon was not doing actions like the Reign of Terror. Napoleon cleaned up the mess.
Early 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte's empire would forcibly spread the secular principles of the French state throughout the continent. Even though Napoleon Bonaparte's empire was short-lived, he was effective in spreading French secular Enlightenment-based ideals throughout Europe in all the many areas where he had established client states.
Napoleon's a good example of the liberal great monarch, in a sense.
When he was ruling, everything you see shaded here in blue. Now, the Napoleonic Wars would end in 1815 as a massive
I just want you to keep in mind, Austrian Empire, Kingdom of Prussia were the defenders of aristocratic Europe. Just keep that in mind. It'll be relevant.
Coalition of states would combine to defeat Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. If you pause and take a look at all the nations you see on the right, you're seeing all the many nations that combined to stop Napoleon from completely conquering Europe, and they were able to do that. However, and this is an example of tensions between the old order and the new order. After
basically what I would call bourgeoisie Europe and then aristocratic Europe.
the Battle of Waterloo, the kingdoms of Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia were restored.
Bourgeoisie is like the self-made man who became rich later on by virtue of, I don't know, like a factory, a company, and so forth. Aristocratic Europe is not just old money, because you'd be bourgeoisie and old money like the Rockefellers, but I mean, you have a status in that land for 1,000 years, like for hundreds and hundreds of years. You are the descendant of the medieval lord, of the duke, of the king, of the prince, and so forth. You have this royal lineage that you might have some inbred ancestors for. You know what I mean? And you have this divine right to be in this position. While the bourgeoisie would say, like, I don't have a divine right. I just made money in this way of business, and I was successful. So that's kind of the difference between the two. He was of a lower aristocracy, but he definitely pushed against the aristocracy and promoted a more bourgeoisie Europe.
The Bourbon dynasty under King Louis XVIII, to become the king of France once again. So for a period, France became a monarchy once again. This represents a clear instance of the old order, represented by the European nations that I just named, as well as the reestablishment of the Bourbon dynasty. So that's the old order gasping for survival in a way.
That's aristocratic Europe, which they're kind of like the welfare queens in a sense. Like they're a group of people that have actually no skill or merit, that just subsidize everything because they're family, while the bourgeoisie actually bring merit and resources and products to people. And they don't just scrape off people's money like a parasite. They actually do the work and get the money, while the aristocrats don't do the work and they get the money anyways because their last name and their lineage and their inheritance.
Western civilization that was rapidly letting go of its old Christendom ideals and
how communists think of billionaires is actually how aristocrats were.
Embracing secular Enlightenment ideals. Throughout the 19th century, echoes of Christian ideals would continue to coexist with the secular ideals of the Enlightenment, but the actual Christian statecraft principles that St. Augustine lays out in the City of God that we talked about in the last video and the very first video of this series were not the guiding principles of the different Western states throughout the 19th century. While the old order that was kind of like the last remnants of Christendom was still gasping for life and trying to reassert itself against these Enlightenment principles, it was in fact the Enlightenment principles, theorized by John Locke, the social contract theory, Adam Smith's new economics.
John Locke's liberalism didn't win. Now, Locke was very influential, but his liberalism did not win at all. Because nobody was restricting the religious liberty of, like, Catholics, which Locke advocated for.
It was those principles which were guiding Western civilization, not the principles of Christendom.
But Locke's liberalism was very Protestant influenced. You'd still have to admit Christianity at least remained under your type of, I guess, liberalism that you think won, even though it didn't.
So let's talk a little bit about the peace of the Treaty of Paris of 1815. So Napoleon had done a lot of damage throughout all of continental Europe, and so the Bourbon dynasty, France, was ordered to pay 700 million francs in reparations to the various affected nations. France's borders were restored to the 1790 borders, losing territory gained in the Revolutionary Wars. Prussia wanted more land to be ceded from eastern France to Prussia, but this was denied by the other allies. As I mentioned a little bit before, the monarchist states of Great Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, they worked together to reestablish the Bourbon dynasty, and those four states also formed a quadruple alliance to establish a
Notice Austria and Prussia, by the way, just keep that in mind.
Balance of power in Europe after the chaos of Napoleon's conquests. These states published a declaration of the powers, and they hoped that their alliance would help prevent any one state from doing what Napoleon had done in the early 1800s. They also promulgated a decree on the abolition of the slave trade, which deemed the institution of slavery to be odious and strongly condemned by the laws of religion and of nature. So you do still see some influence of traditional Christian thought over these, articulated by these old monarchs, where they were applying Christian thought to economics, and they decided that slavery was based on.
And just remember what I said about feudalism and how it completely hurt the average peasant who lived under it. I mean, you were both legally and societally violated absolutely by your lord. I mean, and you also had many natural things taken away from you. For example, the right to have children that were healthy, because a lot of their infants were killed in the process, or the right to have safety. A lot of them were killed in interlord battles over small things like, oh, well, no, God gave me right to this land. No, God gave me right to this land. That led to a lot of death of innocent people. Just think of the 100 Years' Wars and how many peasants that had absolutely nothing to do with that were just brutally murdered. And it's under a system that you believe is the perfect system. under the system that essentially there is people who believe that God gave them power to rule. Well, there's going to be two people who say, well, no, God gave me this power. It's going to be the same religion. And then they're just going to completely murder each other. And that's just going to completely kill a bunch of peasants. Or where the Lord can just have the authority to just force peasants to work even more. That's going to lead to things like the Peasants' Revolt that happened in England, where the aristocrats just responded by just slaughtering peasants.
On the laws of religion. Oh, yes. These 4 states, plus France, once France was kind of rehabilitated over the course of the 19th century, also promulgated an agreement of the perpetual neutrality of Switzerland during this agreement. They allowed Switzerland to remain neutral. Switzerland had kind of chosen to become a militarily neutral nation since the 16th century, and other European powers valued the role that a neutral...
Have you guys ever been to London and look at the Tower of London and the Peasants' Revolt and how they raided it because the aristocrats were just completely violating their rights? Well, then you will see the Catholic system was definitely not perfect, and it oppressed a great majority of the population.
Switzerland could play as a buffer state between France and Prussia. So, by the middle of the 19th century, we have Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and France as 5 major powers who are agreeing to keep a peaceful order in Europe. But as we'll see, the peace of the quote-unquote Concert of Vienna is tenuous, and once particular nations continue to swallow the pill of hypernationalism and begin to worship kind of the glory of their own nation, there's going to be a desire to establish...
Which was the same case, just for different dynasties. I mean, you had people who thought that their dynasties themselves had this sort of divine essence in relation to them due to them being appointed by God, like Louis XIV, who literally depicted himself as a god. And the Bourbon dynasty, which you were citing as being a good representation of the aristocratic order, i.e. the old order of Europe, inbreeding to keep this royal bloodline. I mean, it was just families worshiping each other instead of just nations. It was the same issue. And it led to, again, brutal wars like the 100 Years' Wars, which I'm sure many peasants who had nothing to do with the wars were just brutally murdered in the crossfire. Or brutal revolts like the Peasants' Revolt that led to peasants going against brutal aristocrats and oppressive tyrants that were aristocrats, going off the justification that, no, well, the Catholic Church actually gave me this authority, and God gave me the authority so I can do whatever I want. Figures like, I don't know, King Richard II, who was the king during the revolt. And then they used their religious means to then justify slaughtering the leaders of the revolts, people like Walt Tyler, Jack Straw, Thomas Baker, John Ball, and so forth, these kind of figures.
More and more glory by members of this 5-part alliance who want to be the dominant world power. And this is going to lead this alliance to eventually dissolve, and we're going to see tensions.
And Prussia and Austria never became liberal until like after World War I, and they didn't. And Prussia and Austria didn't even remain consistently liberal after World War I, because you see the rise of fascism. Unless he's going to argue that Hitler was a fascist, which he might. I think in other videos he does. But until he demonstrates that, I'm just going to take the precept that he's not a liberal, because Hitler himself, according to his own accord, was not a liberal.
To brew between the 5 great powers of 19th century Europe. With intra-European conquests being discouraged, European nations all began to turn towards the...
And the Enlightenment also, because in his title he says Hitler son of the Enlightenment. Well, the Enlightenment doesn't presuppose that someone's liberal. There's Enlightenment thinkers that hate liberalism. And there's liberal thinkers who hate the Enlightenment, like Rousseau.
British model of industrialization to continue to grow and advance the glory of their nations. If war is kind of off the table for the time being, industrialization will be the best way to better the lives of their citizens. In 1870, this led to the second wave of industrialization in Europe, which is called the Second Industrial Revolution, and the United States took part in the Second Industrial Revolution as well. The Second Industrial Revolution utilized technologies which were not available during the First Industrial Revolution, such as the telegraph and railroad networks, gas and water supplies, and sewage systems. This Industrial Revolution also led to decreased prices in Europe, because an increased supply of manufactured products by the many new factories in Europe,
which is good, because under Catholic Europe, or even Protestant Europe, peasants were taxed so much they didn't have enough money for surplus food, and a lot of them starved, or weren't able to feed their infants food, and their infants just starved and died anyways.
Led to the need, so there's more supply, so that means there's going to be lowering prices throughout Europe. And if...
Yeah, so poor and middle-class people can now start buying food and not have infants that die out of nowhere because they can't have food. And it gives them the right to have a child, for an example, or the right to have food, and the right to have comfortable living.
No creative solution was found to this. This could have caused a serious issue to the growing economies, which needed to have greater markets to continue to grow. And so many historians believe that declining prices, as more factories were made, prices went down. This led the European nations to have a very strong motivation to to colonize different parts of the world. They had to establish more and more markets to sell their products in order to
Well, which liberal nations colonized this matter? Let's see.
continue to grow their factories and their economy.
Because I view post-1815 Europe to be, again, extremely equivocal. So, same with new imperialism. I don't think it was just done by liberals, and I'll go into that when he starts citing countries.
So this is going to lead to the new imperialism. I wouldn't say that the need for greater markets was the only cause of the new imperialism. I believe hyper-nationalism was a dramatic cause of this as well. Many colonies were not exactly profitable for these nations, but they did it because of a desire to glorify
I swear, if this guy cites like the Austrian Empire, dude, all my days.
their nation and participate.
By the way, just to be clear, the Austrian Empire was still under feudalism, and it was considered arch-conservative. So this will be interesting if he cites a feudalist empire as an example, or like Prussia, which I already demonstrated that they were not liberal either.
In the scramble to
Prussia was an example of a declining aristocracy, and the Austrian Empire was an example of a country stuck in old Europe, still doing semi-feudalism.
conquer the world and become the greatest world power. This map you see here, everything in green was at some point colonized or controlled by Europe. And most of the areas you see in green are going to be colonized in the 19th century in the period of new imperialism. And then even areas that weren't technically colonized, like China and Saudi Arabia, they were at some point under European influence, which means they basically had to import a certain amount of products from European nations. So they were still helping to benefit.
Which was free trade. I don't see anything wrong with that. That's good. Referring to like being influenced and stuff like trade. We had that in the Middle Ages. And what led to the old imperialism, which I assume you're going to defend, was also matters of trade, because Columbus, I believe, was going to somewhere trying to find India for matters of trade.
The European economies. Let's contrast old imperialism versus new imperialism. So the old imperialism of the 16th and 17th centuries was mostly Spanish dominated. That was the main global power in the 16th, 17th centuries. Spain was the largest empire in world history, by the way. It was guided by medieval economic principles of mercantilism.
Wait. Hold on. If they're the biggest empire in history, but you just said the new imperialism was a lot more expansive, and you're using that as some type of critique. So are you going to now criticize the Spanish Empire? And in relation to this, like, I don't know, aristocratic Europe and how they colonized, let's use Spanish for example. The conquest done by the Spanish resulted in millions of deaths of the indigenous people. And it was also described by modern historians as a major genocide. Many, you could say, I guess, died from like diseases, but there was also extreme violence, starvation, and forced labor. You also had the Spanish Empire actively participating in the transatlantic slave trade, which was one of the worst slave trades we've seen in history. That was again started by, guess what, aristocratic Europe, and it was also vindicated by Pope Nicholas V. Let's find the bull from Pope Nicholas V, bull supporting the slave trade. The slave trade. It was his bull called Dum Diversas. Here, let me screen share this. Look at this. So, a papal bull issued in 1452 by Pope Nicholas V authorized King Alfonso V of Portugal to fight, subjugate, conquer those rising against the Catholic faith, to extinguish the Christian religion, namely the Muslims and pagans in African territory, those who lost to perpetual servitude, issued Nicholas 1455. Portuguese saw this as a moral justification to freely acquire slaves along the African coast by force or trade. The edicts are thus seen to have facilitated the Portuguese slave trade from West Africa, and as having legitimized the European colonization of the African continent. So all this colonialism you see that this guy's siding against liberalism, just know it originated from his Pope, Pope Nicholas V, and his papal bull. And he believes the Pope is endowed this authority by God, for the papal bull. So, criticize your church, man. It's your church who actually initially gave the Europeans the so-called right to colonize Africans.
So there's a sense that global wealth and resources were limited. And so the main purpose of these colonies, the main economic goal, was to acquire resources. For the Spanish, this often just meant acquiring gold in the Western Hemisphere and establishing a feudal network of farms and agriculture to be able to,
which led to forced labor,
utilize the resources of fertile soil to produce more crops.
Let's just completely steal all these guys' natural resources and force them, in particular labor, and then force them to adopt our cultural customs. That's essentially what they did.
And in French Canada, the main resource that was desired was beaver furs. Missionaries played huge roles in Catholic colonies and old imperialism. The new imperialism was British dominated. It was guided by hyper-nationalism and the need to establish new markets as European.
Not entirely. British colonialism, liberal. I'll admit that was liberal. Their goal was for a civilizing mission. For an example, liberal imperialism brought infrastructure and technology. The British invested in railways, telegraph lines, and modern industrial infrastructure, especially within India. The colonial administrations introduced English common law and parliamentary systems, which in some areas laid the groundwork for future democratic institutions. Um, they also established schools and taught the English language, which remains key, a common language in many former colonies today. Colonial authorities disseminated modern medical knowledge and improved sanitation in certain regions. In some cases, the British intervened to stop local practices that were viewed as uncivilized. So the British colonists were just attempting to make these other countries resemble a first world nation. That was their goal.
Nations.
And it's been demonstrated within their policies. And you could find people like the liberal imperialists advocate for this.
Hesitant to import goods from other European nations. There was a desire to establish colonies to export goods to those foreign colonies. The main goal was not necessarily to spread Christianity or Catholicism, as it was during the old imperialism, where missionaries had a huge...
It was to spread modern technology and modern medicine. In general, common good practices, like when the Indians would, what's it called? There was a woman who was a widow and she'd have to like burn herself alive. Like, obviously that's wrong. You could just naturally deduce that. So the British would just stop it. So they stopped like very clearly inhumane practices, and then they also boosted the technology in medicine.
Role in the old imperial colonies. The goal in the new imperialism was to spread civilization. That included the freedom of religion.
Thank you. Spread civilization, exactly.
And so missionaries were free to go to colonies from these. Missionaries were free to go to the colonies of these different new imperialist colonies. However, they weren't the main ones. The goal for these of spreading civilization was about spreading secular enlightenment values. Okay, like I said.
Not just that. I mean, also modern medicine and modern technology. But I guess you intersected the two when you spoke of the scientific revolution and industrial revolution, having a cause and effect onto the Enlightenment.
It includes the freedom of religion, but religion itself is not the main thing that these European nations are trying to spread.
Yeah, so what? I mean, the religion being the main thing, I mean, killed a bunch of indigenous people. And I'm sure in the lands of India where they've had an established religion for thousands and thousands of years, longer than even Christianity has been around, they're obviously not going to accept that well, and it's going to just lead to a bunch of death.
Just some maps to contrast the old imperialism from the new imperialism. This is a map of the Spanish Empire in the old imperial period. This is a map of the Spanish Empire in the early 20th century. This is all they had left. This is a map of the British Empire in the early 18th centuries, and this is a map of the British Empire in the early 20th.
Yeah, and a lot of these countries developed a lot under British rule and have better medicine today now, and have better technology today because of the British influence.
These are all of the territories which Britain claimed in the new imperial period. These are all the territories that Prussia.
Okay, and Prussia was not liberal. Prussia was ruled by a declining aristocracy, and they had very anti-liberal figures like Bismarck ruling the land. And he even said, according to his own account of liberalism, there needs to be religious freedom, as he said it before. While Bismarck began to criminalize Catholicism. So obviously, according to his own accord, Prussia was not liberal. Obviously, I don't define liberalism that way. But the reason I don't think he was liberal is because he didn't have any liberal policies, really. He mainly had policies to promote the aristocratic origins of Europe.
Or which would become Germany, claimed in the new imperial period. Once France was capable of establishing a global empire, so basically the Bourbon dynasty would end up being overthrown and it would eventually be replaced by a new empire under Napoleon III. Napoleon III had taken over a French empire which was very small after its humiliations in the 7 Years' War and then the Napoleonic Wars, but he would begin to reestablish himself as a global power. These are the territories which France would claim in the new imperialist period. America.
In respect to like the French, hold on. I'm pretty sure that relation to Napoleon III. Yeah. I would agree. Like liberalism and imperialism under France could have had some issues, but it was definitely a lot more moral than Catholic French imperialism. For example, the Catholic French imperialists in aristocratic Europe had things like the slave trade because of Nicholas V, and they felt the justification. It wasn't just the Portuguese guys. Notice how it said the Europeans also. And the French also had chattel slavery, but under Napoleon III, they actually banned slavery. or they upheld the ban. So the ban happened in 1848, and Napoleon III upheld it even within his colonialism. So you could say, yeah, there's some issues with Napoleon III's colonialism, but it was definitely way more moral than the aristocratic Catholic imperialism.
The United States would also join in the new imperialist period. In the top section here, you can see how
a lot of this was defensive anyways.
The United States spread out throughout our own continent. We could call that the Manifest Destiny expansion, which was the American.
Which was good, by the way. I mean, good to a certain extent. I mean, here, let me show you this. I'll show you the essential doctrines of Manifest Destiny. The assumption of the unique moral virtue of the United States. The assertion that the mission is to redeem the world, to spread of Republican government, and more generally the American way of life. The faith in the nation's divinely ordained destiny. I thought liberalism was atheistic. I thought this was atheistic imperialism. Divinely ordained. So essentially, American imperialists just thought that the North American continent and South American continent were granted to them by virtue of the Monroe Doctrine to spread natural rights to these people. Now, the annexation of Hawaii was highly controversial. I believe it was Grover Cleveland. One of the presidents protested after his presidency. Yeah. Okay, so it was Grover Cleveland. He actually created a group to formally oppose the overthrow of Hawaii. That was something that highly controversial. Most Americans did not support. That was very rare.
American desire to conquer everything between the East Coast and the West Coast. The new imperialist expansions began with a variety of.
I would say these ones on the left section were definitely not controversial, but the ones on the right section, a lot of these were highly controversial. I mean, the Alaskan wasn't really colonialism; it was just buying something from the Russians. The annexation of Hawaii, that was highly controversial.
Guano Islands, which you can see on the bottom of the screen, and then the Spanish-American War in the late 19th century gave the United States the territories of the Philippines, Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and in 1898 we also annexed Hawaii after.
I think the Spanish-American War was mainly, I believe, used because the Spanish were acting as like a catalyst for the war. Due to the sinking of the USS Maine ship in 1898. So that was defensive anyways. I wouldn't even call that imperialism. It was just the U.S. defending itself.
American colonists, not American colonists, but American-born citizens of the Kingdom of Hawaii actually overthrew the Hawaiian Queen. They established a Hawaiian Republic.
Yeah, which was heavily opposed by the President Grover Cleveland. It wasn't the American government that was advocating for this.
And then they sought to gain admission in the United States in 1898. We also gained Alaska in 1867, and we gained Samoa in 1900. Now, our nation's own desire to expand its markets overseas led to Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853 leading 4 battleships into the ports of Japan to forcibly end Japan's centuries-long policy of isolation. Japan was forced to grant the United States economic privileges, so we gained a huge foreign market there to export.
And why is that bad? I mean, we were just opening up an isolated nation, so what?
Our products. The immediate justification for Matthew Perry's foreign intervention was the alleged mistreatment of American.
And it was also defensive, like you said. We were trying to open up isolated Spain or isolated Japan, and isolated Japan was also harming our men. So I don't see any issue with using a defense and then opening up a nation after defending ourselves from that nation.
Shipwrecked soldiers who found themselves stranded on Japanese shores. We're going to go back to Japan in just a minute, so just.
The Austrians were a semi-feudalist aristocratic country, and the Prussians were a nation that were trying to preserve this declining aristocracy. So they were reacting to liberalism by trying to become the main anti-liberal source within the Europe. So these were just 2 anti-liberal nations trying to become the biggest anti-liberal nation. So this is not caused by liberalism.
Shelf that, but basically the forced opening of Japan would humiliate the Japanese people and lead them to imitate. And Prussia and Austria were awkwardly members of this confederation because it was unclear which state would be the dominant.
I mean, I've already showed you these guys are not liberal, so let's just skip.
Aided by Commodore Perry's forced opening of its ports and its economy, Japan would go through a cultural and economic and political revolution called the Meiji Restoration. This was essentially an oligarchical coup over the traditional Tokugawa shogunate, which was the military rulership of Japan that had been in place for centuries.
Which, by the way, led to a lot of oppression. The Japanese, under their more traditional state, brutally murdered Catholic martyrs. I mean, it's not like the old aristocratic Japan was good.
The Meiji oligarchical restoration established a modern military, which had forced conscription and adopted modern technology. You can see a depiction of that in the movie Last Samurai. It abolished the social caste system, abolishing the samurai social class.
Which is good because caste systems lead to a high amount of oppression, domestically speaking.
Class. It instituted modern taxation and a modern diet or parliamentary system of government. Certain traditional elements of Japanese culture were discouraged, if not outlawed. Samurai were not allowed to carry weapons in public, and the Japanese cosmetic trend in which women paint
Good. Why would you want people to carry weapons in public? That's pretty dangerous.
Did their teeth black was very discouraged. As Japan attempted to industrialize
And that's not even legal.
its economy in imitation of the secular states of the West, it too
It
would take part in the era of new imperialism.
Let's see. Was the Meiji? Hold on. It wasn't even caused by liberal ideology. They were just trying to resist Western colonialism. That was their intention. And again, not all the Western colonizers were liberals. Like again, the Prussians were not liberals. Like the Belgians were not liberals. They might have been against the British, who happened to be liberals, and I guess they could have been trying to resist against the British. You could argue, but they themselves were not colonizing because of liberalism. They actually opposed the Western expansion by liberalism, and they were trying to fight that.
Conquering Taiwan and the Koreas, as well as other territories. As we talked about earlier, Italy would help Prussia to defeat Austria in the Austro-Prussian War. As a reward, it received the region of Veneto as compensation, and after the Italian secular state received Veneto, its military would march upon Rome itself, and the secular Italian kingdom conquered Papal States once and for all.
Well, that's because, for multiple reasons, they were trying to unify the entirety of their nation after the Napoleonic War. So they're trying to create an identity after Napoleon kind of dismantled their nation.
From that period until 1929, the Pope would consider himself to be a prisoner of the Vatican, imprisoned by the secular Italian Masonic state.
Oh my days, dude. It was liberal, but the reason they were trying to unify is because they were basically a very divided nation of a bunch of city-states. And they realized the only way to survive in the modern type of Europe, which again was not just liberal nations, but also non-liberal nations, was to unify. And Pius IX, he did very controversial things that probably shouldn't have been done. For an example, forcefully baptizing the babies of a Jewish family, and things like that. I mean, he was that Pope, obviously. He was breaking that. That's very problematic. I mean, that's basically just kidnapping somebody. He literally kidnapped a Jewish family's child, which, in my opinion, is highly controversial. So it's not like he's the best person maybe to be ruling a nation if he's kidnapping the family of a Jewish the baby of a Jewish family. I could name the case. Hold on. It's called the Mortera case. I'll show you guys. Hold on. Here. This is the Pope who declared himself a prisoner, and he was literally kidnapping kids to make them Catholic. I don't think this is the best guy to be using as a source, and I think that guy should not be ruling a country if he's literally kidnapping people to make them Catholic.
Now, in 1881, Italy wanted to establish its own colonial empire. It attempted to divide Tunisia with France, as Italians lived in Tunisia, but France ignored them and took the entire region of Africa for themselves. In 1865, Italy failed to purchase the Nicobar Islands from Denmark. In 1882, the Assab Bay was annexed by the government from Italian merchants. So Italian merchants purchased this region, and then the Italian government took it from the merchants. This was the beginning of the Italian Empire. It later annexed the port of Massawa with British support. It would occupy Italian Somaliland, and that would become Italy's foothold in Africa. It would fail to conquer Ethiopia, even though it attempted this in 18.
I would argue the Italian imperialism here, I mean, it's not that problematic. For example, Italy's like expansion in 1882 into Eritrea and Somalia and Libya. They were trying to export civilization, spread influence of their liberal values. And nations where Somalia, which we see even today, is very much so not as civilized as, especially Somaliland, where there was a recent case of them stoning a child just because they got raped. I think those nations ought to be conquered and then civilized so we can extinguish those type of practices. And I would say that's a lot more moral when the Catholic Europe is trying to extinguish particular practices in the nations they conquered, because the Crusaders, for example, when trying to colonize these lands, didn't just extinguish problematic practices like the Italians did, but they ate people. I'll show you the case. It was the Siege of Marara, where the Crusaders quite literally just began eating people. So you can't act like this is something that's new or unique to liberalism to conquer nations. I mean, you guys conquer nations, but you didn't just conquer nations. You literally ate people. Here's the thing, and here's the source. It says Rubinstein. Here's the book. page 526 to 537. So, yeah, Italians conquered nations and tried to extinguish very problematic practices, but you ate people. So I think the Italian imperialism is a lot more moral than, I guess, what you would say would be aristocratic imperialism.
1889. As I mentioned, the new secular Japanese state would begin its own colonial enterprises in 1896, as a result of the Sino-Japanese War.
By the way, it's not a too cool quay because I'm saying that it's there's definitely a moral development in respect to liberalism, and I would agree it wasn't the most moral thing for Italy to do. We're definitely in I would say, the more moral state now. I think history is a development of morality over time, and it leads to a democratic institution like we see today. But I would say this was the intermediate of their development to a more moral system. And I'm giving an example of how he can't just say this is liberalism. It's also aristocratic Europe. This is just a case of a development of society.
Or after Japan completely embarrassed China, which was really still a feudal society, Japan conquered Taiwan.
It's like the Austrian Empire, which he declared as being an example of liberal war. And again, the Japanese were conquering these nations not due to liberalism, but in response to the West, which you could find, I don't know, pre-liberal examples of this, like the Muslims and the Rashidun Caliphate. They conquered a bunch of the Christian lands because they didn't want Christian influence, and the Zoroastrian lands by the Persians because they didn't want Zoroastrian influence. The same thing happens outside of liberalism. It's just a common theme in history where people react to other empires, and that's all Japan was doing.
This was a great humiliation to China because they always perceived Japan as a sort of little brother, and this humiliation would cause China to begin secularizing as well.
They didn't. That's problematic to an extent. China didn't secularize as much as you think. It depends what you mean by, I guess, secularize. If what you mean is liberalize, I wouldn't entirely agree. Because they remained more so into a conservative nationalist state until the Cultural Revolution by Mao Zedong.
It wouldn't be long after 1906 that at this time it used to be a kingdom. In 1904, the Russo-Japanese War was fought, and Japan had so thoroughly modernized, secularized, and westernized its nation and its institutions in imitation of the Enlightenment-based institutions of Western nations that Japan actually embarrassed Russia and defeated them quickly in this war.
This wasn't liberalism, it was just an imperialist competition, and I know he's trying to say imperialism is caused by liberalism, but he hasn't demonstrated that adequately enough. And Tsar Nicholas II was definitely not liberal. For example, Tsar Nicholas II had a feudal estate. He rejected reform. He was a severe autocrat. He resisted modernization that we're seeing in other European nations. Nicholas II was definitely not at all liberal, and he had a competition against the Japanese.
What does that say about Russia?
So it's not caused by liberalism in that regard.
While Russia was still a member of the Quadruple Alliance established by the Congress of Vienna, Russia retained a late medieval economic structure and was falling
At least he admits it. Okay, good. At least this guy's honest enough to admit it.
behind Prussia, Britain, and France, and even Japan, as we just saw, technologically and militarily. This was evident, as we just said, in the Russo-Japanese War, but also in the Crimean War, in which Britain quickly defeated Russia in a conflict. Russia's expansions were not really...
Prussia was not liberal again, but anyways.
From the... Russia's territorial expansions were not really from the late imperial period, the second imperialism. It was more from 16th and 17th and 18th centuries that Russia was able to expand.
By the way, keeping that medieval structure obviously demonstrated as a disaster because it led to peasants revolting and causing the Russian Revolution.
To the massive size it has today. So that was back when the other European nations also had a mercantilist form of economy. Russia's economy did not really grow along with the rest of Western Europe. Now, some historians argue that Russia did want to annex parts of Africa when other European nations were doing this. Some historians argue that Russia wanted to annex Ethiopia, but they were incapable of doing so. On the left is a map of Africa in 1880. It's a speculative map. A lot of the regions you see shaded are tribal areas with not clearly defined borders. On the right, you see a map of Africa in 1913. As you can see, nearly the entire continent has been divided amongst European powers, showing how quickly the technological...
Belgium was not liberal. The German Empire was not liberal. Spain was not liberal. Portugal, I mean, Salazar, you can really call him liberal. France is liberal. UK was liberal. Obviously, the Sultan's not liberal. Come on. Most of these European nations colonizing Africa are not even liberal.
Revolution and the military technology of the European nations allowed them to take over an entire continent. This shows you how dramatically ahead Western Europe became as a result of the technological revolution. And
Belgian imperialism was heavily influenced by Leopold II, and he was not a liberal. Most would agree he was an authoritarian leader who tried to use philanthropic rhetoric to disguise his, of course, brutal regime. But He was considered a builder king, and he was not a liberal at all. He was a staunch autocrat and a part of the declining aristocracy, which I was speaking of.
Industrialization, how dramatically ahead they were from the rest of the world.
I think the declining aristocracy really died out after the First World War, and you only see remnants of it like in Britain or in Liechtenstein.
Especially Africa at this time.
Or Liechtenstein, I think it's pronounced.
Let's talk about the 1885 Berlin Conference. From 84 to 1885, 15 European nations met in Berlin to discuss how to avoid European conflicts in Africa. So this was basically where the scramble for Africa began. It was determined that a European power's claims to African territory would only be recognized by the other nations if they could demonstrate that they possessed effective occupation of the said territory. This led to the need to establish large numbers of troops in each African territory, which was very expensive, and established...
Which is not caused by liberalism, because a lot of these nations themselves are not even liberal.
...direct systems of government, rather than simply relying on alliances.
This is literally just a one liberal nation just meeting with a bunch of declining aristocrats who want to keep their land in Africa.
With local systems of government.
And when people decline, they tend to conquer and start wars because it makes them feel that sense of power.
So because of the Berlin Conference, European nations that wanted to colonize Africa needed to establish a very clear and direct form of government. It needed to be very obvious that...
This is just an example of old order Europe, which this guy's trying to defend, trying to exist in a modern, liberalizing, secularizing world. And trying to react to it by making themselves more expansive. But that's just an irrational reaction.
A particular European nation was the direct rulers of that African territory, which might sound fine on paper, but what that's going to end up causing is a great disruption in the local tribal networks of governance. And it's going to cause these various African societies to be completely disrupted from their traditional systems of self-autonomy, and it's going to end up disrupting their economic trade networks with one another as well, because all the tribes within a particular European colony are going to need to start trading with the European nation, first and foremost, as a member of their economies.
Yeah, and obviously you're fine with that. We're both fine with that because you're fine with the Spanish Empire doing this. I'm fine with the Americans doing this on an international level with free trade, the United Nations and so forth as more liberal. You're fine with the Spanish Empire doing this with the indigenous tribes of the Americas.
Rather than trading with one another. This is going to cause the various tribes living throughout Africa to become much less self-sufficient, and that would cause great harm to the various peoples of Africa.
It's not entirely true. I mean, if you look at the grand scheme of things, only like 100, if you go to 100 years after this in the 1980s, a lot of these African countries now have an act of self-determination and are able to rule by themselves.
The remainder of the 20th and then the 21st centuries. Also, instituting direct rule is going
to rule themselves in a more developed and, more developed system. They're definitely, I would argue, a lot more civilized in the 1980s than they were, before they were conquered by the Europeans, because they were more so in tribal networks back then. Now they're a general centralized country.
To upset chieftains and cause lots of strife and unnecessary conflicts. If there was no Berlin Conference, most European nations would have found it more useful to simply form alliances with local chieftains. And
notice how he puts Leo the Pole engaged in personal humanitarian. Yeah, humanitarianism is not liberal. I think that's kind of an absurd thing to say. For an example, there's particular people, I guess this guy would say he's Catholic, so I don't know. Would he say Pope Francis was liberal? Because, Pope Francis advocated for humanitarianism. I think that's just a general thing held by the West. Now, I would say Catholic Europe definitely violated humanitarianism, but I wouldn't say it's liberal in and of itself, because there's non-liberals like Pope Francis who would hold to it. Liberal in the political sense, of course, because I would say Pope Francis was theologically liberal, but I wouldn't say he was politically liberal to the full extent.
Allow them to self-govern under the direction of, the ultimate direction of the European power through the parliamentary government, which was in place in Belgium. So he actually acquired permission from the other European powers to possess the Free State of the Congo as his own personal possession. It was not a colony of Belgium. It was a possession of Leopold II himself. He was an absolute monarch over the Congo.
Absolute monarch. But remember how before he tried to declare liberalism as being something that's more democratic. So according to his own accord, he's not even a liberal.
He was able to gain permission to do this by claiming that he was engaged in personal humanitarian and philanthropic work in the Congo, and working through Parliament would have slowed down his ability to help the people there. This, of course, was not exactly true. In the Congo Free State, there was a great...
Yeah, his imperialism is absolutely awful. I'm not going to deny that, but that's just an example of the declining... what's it called? Was he... Hold on. Well, let's see. Yeah, the declining Catholic aristocracy trying to exist in a modern world, because Leopold II was Catholic. He's an example of a declining Catholic aristocracy existing in the 19th century. So I'm going to credit all this to the declining Catholic aristocracy. Let's get past it. Just read this. All of this is not by liberals, but by what this guy supports, a declining Catholic aristocracy.
Colonies in the new imperialism, and shed some light about why
we all agree it's bad, so let's just go past before you... Yeah.
European power.
Franco-Prussian War. The Prussians were an anti-liberal force fighting the perceived liberal force. Let's see who started the war. Let's Google. Who started the Franco-Prussian War of 1870? Was it started by the liberals or the declining aristocracy? Oh, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Great. So the declining aristocracy was just going ballistic and waging wars against liberals. So let's blame the declining aristocracy, not the liberal nation, for this.
Some believe Otto von Bismarck provoked France to war under Napoleon III's reign in order to gain the allegiance of independent Germanic states into the Northern German Confederation. Napoleon III did, in fact, declare war in 1870, and Prussia retaliated. Prussia utilized modern military transportation network.
Declared war because it was provoked by the declining aristocratic state. So this old Europe, the Bourbons, right, all the way back then, these guys still exist in states like the Austrian Empire or the German Empire or the Belgian Empire and so forth. And they're just causing wars with just modern technology because that's obviously going to be inhabited just by virtue of development technologically. That doesn't make you a liberal because liberal is something that's abstract, not concrete. So it's these guys with, I don't know, something that's concrete, but they have the abstract ideology of the declining aristocracy. And they're provoking wars and causing death. So it's actually your side. I guess you're a Catholic, but it would be the Protestant declining aristocracy causing these mass wars now at this point.
Modern military artilleries and modern railroads to a much greater extent than Napoleon III did. Prussian forces captured Napoleon III, they successfully sieged Paris, and they actually ended Napoleon III's empire and kind of forced France to establish a third republic, which was promulgated in 1875. As I said earlier, as a result of the Franco-Prussian War, all the Germanic states, except for Austria and Switzerland, declared their union in a new German empire. So Portugal was more involved in new imperialism as an attempt to maintain the colonies that they had possessed since the old imperial period. Portugal has established all the colonies you see here, as you can see much earlier, and Spain had very few colonies left after the Spanish-American War, and they did not establish any new colonies in the new imperialist period. Was the old Catholic imperialism really any better than the new imperialism? Well, the old imperialism was closely monitored by the Pope, who intervened to prevent conflicts between Catholic nations, such as in the Treaty of Tordesillas, which prevented war between Spain and Portugal in South America. The old imperialism was seen first and foremost by the church and many explorers as an opportunity to spread the gospel. Now, in practice, profit-driven mercantilists seized on the opportunity to sell in colonies to make a fortune. These individuals.
Is that why you had people like Pope Nicholas V, who helped lead to the transatlantic slave trade, the most brutal trade we've ever seen in history?
Individuals were often not key citizens, not ideal citizens. Oftentimes, the kinds of people who were motivated by greed to go move far away from their homelands to make a fortune were not the best of people. And so many of the old imperialist colonizers were not necessarily...
Or let's say Pope Alexander. Let's see what Pope Alexander VI did. Alexander VI bull renewed by Pope Sixtus IV and Pope Leo X. The concept for consigning exclusive spheres, nation states extend to the Americas, 1493. So the use of innocent and infidels as forced labor was allowed by Alexander VI and Leo X and Sixtus IV, but it was later revoked by Paul III. So it depends who was Pope. A lot of the popes were for tyranny, for forced labor, for slavery, like Alexander VI was, Sixtus IV was, Leo X was, although some popes like Paul III were against it. So I would say it was a very rocky transition. This is all contingent and context dependent on who the Pope was.
Regardless, missionaries were given prominent roles in French and Spanish colonies. The monarchs expected missionaries to have this prominent role because this was part of the justification for establishing colonies in...
You also notice this guy says French Canada, the colonists often intermarried with Native Americans. Well, in Louis XVI's Europe, he banned race mixing. So, I mean, that's also under the aristocratic old Europe.
These old Christian societies. Because the missionaries had a prominent role in these societies, they monitored the behavior of colonists and they bettered the living conditions of indigenous people.
They also murdered people who refused to become a Catholic under the Spanish Inquisition,
who lived under the clouds of paganism by liberating them by the light of the gospel and teaching them.
By forcing people. Hold on. I'm pretty sure there was a case of. Hold on. I'm pretty sure there's like a lot of brutal cases. Yeah, there was chronicles that described instances of Spanish soldiers in the Americas, killing them and stabbing them in the belly. Let me show you this. Look at this. This is the old one that he's being an apologist for. Spaniards killed women, killed over slaying conquistadors. The heads of the captive Spanish women were strung up on skull racks alongside those of men An analysis of the bones revealed that women were pregnant and in pre-Hispanic practice that may have qualified them as warriors. Let me see. So that's one case. Okay, photos of the youngsters. The placement of the burial suggests that there were people fleeing or massacred and buried hurriedly. The Institute says women and children were sheltering inside rooms, were mutilated. Again, this is as evidenced by discovery of hacked bones. The temples were burned, statues decapitated. So this is what Catholic Europe and missionaries were doing. They were mutilating children and pregnant women.
Certain things that Western civilization had developed, which indigenous peoples may not have been aware of. In French Canada, the colonists from France even often intermarried with Native Americans, showing that there was.
But the French king, who was the head of the Catholic Europe here, at least not Catholic Europe, sorry, Catholic France, was against race mixing.
Mutual respect between the indigenous people and the French colonists.
Yeah, mutual respect. Yeah, while you're murdering pregnant women and children. Got it.
The new imperialist era, on the other hand, was more pervasive because of the dramatic technological advantages of 19th century Western civilization. In the new imperialism, missionaries may have been permitted to journey to these new lands, but they did not have a prominent role in these new colonies.
Where were the new imperialists murdering pregnant women and children? Like at such a systematic level that the old imperialists were. Where did they cut the stomachs of pregnant women and murder the babies inside those stomachs under the name of God? Where did they do that?
Motivation for establishing colonies was to exert global dominance and strengthen the nation's economy. And the ideological goal may have been to spread civilization, but as I've said, civilization was defined as John Locke's social contract theory and Adam Smith's economic theory.
Not entirely. Civilization could have been this British spanning practices like murdering widows and burning them alive, which you as a Catholic would say was wrong. Which is definitely a lot less arbitrary by saying Catholicism is than civilization. I'll show you the source for this, by the way. It's called sati. So this was a practice done by the Hindus. A cold form of sati, or the neglect and casting out Hindu widows, have been prevalent. Diminish the rights of women. Practice where women burn themselves alive. The first formal British ban was imposed in 1798. And by the way, in 1813, 1829 ban. So this is after 1815 when they became liberal. The more, I guess, traditional figures who would be opposed to liberalism were the ones protesting it in Italy, or in India, sorry. And then this guy, post age 15, governor, 1828 seed look post. So in the liberal period, banned it and rejected the pleas. So in old imperialism, you get pregnant women and children being slaughtered. And in new imperialism, you get women's rights being protected by very, very disgusting tribal practices done by the natives of those lands.
And other Enlightenment thought, which included freedom of religion, allowing missionaries to journey to the new colonies, but spreading the gospel was not a primary goal of new imperialists. New imperialist empires were problematic when they dramatically disrupted local economic and political networks in order to establish plantations, to allocate resources to whole nations, and establish direct rule to convince other European powers.
The new imperialism had a very, very low amount of slavery, while the old imperialism was full of plantations and slavery. What are you talking about?
That they did have effective occupation of their claimed territories. These colonies benefited European economies, but disrupted and even in times destroyed the sustainability of local economies, so that once these local economies eventually declared independence, they would be incapable of really declaring economic independence from.
That's not true. I mean, look at, let's see, Nigeria's GDP is $334 billion. It's at a growth rate of 4.2%. Their GDPs are doing pretty well. I mean, they have self-independence now.
The European economies that had absorbed them. Concerning World War I, the new imperialism heightened the sense of an impending cosmic clash between the global empires originating in Europe, which came to perceive themselves.
It was basically a liberal versus the World War I is kind of like, this is how I like to look at it. There's the declining aristocracy and the liberals. They know in the future, in the next 100 years, one of them is going to have to go and one of them is going to have to win. The declining aristocrats start the war to finally restore Europe back to the declining aristocracy and to finally root out liberalism. But liberals end up winning. That's kind of how I view it. Like, I think the Kaiser wanted the British to get involved, and that's why he got involved after the British warned him and so forth, and then the British got involved. So I think World War I was the chance for the imperial declining aristocracy to no longer be declining and to be a forwarding aristocracy like they were once before 1815. But obviously that wasn't the case. They lost the war, and the aristocracy kind of lost its power, and liberalism won, I guess, on a like unilateral level in Europe.
Themselves as a sort of Olympian pantheon of nations, which were invincible in warfare because they had.
Also, all these nations were not liberal.
seeing how invincible they had been against the many different nations of the world. So the European nations began to perceive themselves as, in a sense, gods amongst the mere mortal nations of the rest of the world.
And so did Catholic Europe. You saw yourselves as the Catholics who had this God-given mission to then spread Catholicism to the pagan civilizations. And you also believe that, or not you, but the Catholic Europeans, some of them believed their kings to be gods, like Louis XIV depicted himself as a god.
And the mortal nations, which had not undergone, the industrial.
Now, of course, he believed in the metaphorical sense, like Louis XIV, but so did the new imperialists. Because a lot of them were just still Christian aristocrats who were against liberalism, and the liberals obviously don't believe themselves to be God.
Industrial and technological revolutions. Okay, so that is our discussion of the new imperialism. We have a few more topics to talk about here.
Okay, guys, so that's the end of the video. If you guys enjoy videos like this of me refuting videos by Catholics trying to critique liberalism, then like the video. I can be responding to other videos of his if you guys want. But like the video, subscribe, comment down below. God bless.